All right, we are now live for the next AMA. It's July, half the year is gone, as I'm highly conscious of. So let's get started. There's already some good questions lined up pertaining to a bunch of different things. So David asks, how does Stoicism handle a situation with a spouse that has dementia? So the first thing to say, and this may seem a little bit petty, but I think it's an important point to make. Stoicism doesn't handle anything. Stoics, applying the principles and practices of the philosophical system that we kind of halfway have from antiquity called Stoicism, they handle these things. And it's not as if like there's a pat Stoic answer for each single thing, as you find out when you look at these people. So, Stoicism would suggest a bunch of insights, things to suggest to yourself, to keep in mind, practices that you can do. And, it'd be similar to other things that you'd be dealing with a spouse who is in a challenging situation. Dementia is something that runs across a spectrum. There's like little, as we call them, senior moments where people have lapses and they're not quite getting things all the way to like you have no idea what's going on and all sorts of things in between. And what would a stoic do in dealing with a spouse, somebody you've made a lifelong commitment to, who is suffering from dementia? Well, first of all, you'd be showing them a lot of understanding and compassion and trying to realize the situation that they're in and that they didn't choose to, you know, not understand things or forget things or anything along those lines. So you'd be pretty forgiving towards them, and you would sort of like think ahead to what sort of problems and challenges that not only they're likely to encounter but you're likely to encounter as a result. So you probably would engage in some negative visualization, thinking about, all right, this is probably not going to get better, this is going to get worse. How am I going to deal with the fact that my spouse doesn't know who the people around them are, perhaps even who I am? Am I able to handle this? I think Stoicism can also be useful for helping wean you away from negative emotions and, we could say excessive reactions. I mean, if your spouse has dementia, that's going to suck. And it's probably not going to get better over time, but you can still love them and they can still enjoy things. I mean, my wife and I, we're both in our 50s, and one of the things that we know is that music is very important to us and that music can be quite helpful for people who have dementia. And we may end up suffering that. So we're already sort of like lining up playlists of music that helps us reconnect. And, is that necessarily tied to Stoicism? No, but a Stoic would want to exercise prudence, right? And I think developing courage, not just in the sense of like facing fears, but being persevering would also be important as well. So I mean, there's a lot more that could be said about that. That could be like an entire workshop, I think, but we'll just leave that there because there's already a lot of other questions. So Jacob says, thoughts on UFOs and aliens. Have you heard what the whistleblower David Grush has said? Good resources in philosophy for the implications of non-human intelligence among us. So three different things. I don't really have thoughts on UFOs and aliens in any sort of like well worked out sense. I mean, I like speculative fiction. I don't actually have any reason to think that there are unidentified flying objects or aliens among us or anything like that. So I don't really think too much about that. And I don't know who David Grush has said because I'm not into UFO communities or anything like that. Now, interestingly, resources in philosophy for the implications of non human intelligence among us. So, not just philosophy, but speculative fiction. You could think of speculative fiction as running through a bunch of different scenarios and thinking about like how should we approach, as we call it, first contact, or the revelation that there would be aliens among us or something like that. And it ranges the gamut. I mean, there aren't any. I mean, there's probably somebody out there who's written a book, philosophy of you know extraterrestrials or something, but that's not an area that I work in. But I would say that, if they are rational beings, we could ask ourselves questions like, are all rational beings similarly going to be rational? Can they live together well? Are they inevitably going to be drawn into conflict or things like that? And I think there's a lot of great speculations out there about that. But that's all they are, is speculations at this point, until we actually run into some bona fide aliens, I suppose. Darth says, "Where were there any philosophers who stuttered?" Yeah, I'm sure there have been plenty of philosophers who stuttered. I actually had not a philosophy professor, but a anthropology professor who stuttered, and we talked about it in class and how he dealt with it. And so, yeah, there's philosophers who've had all sorts of interesting issues with speech. Do they write about their experience with difficulty speaking? Did it influence their philosophy? I mean, I haven't, like, nobody comes to mind, but I'm sure if you Google it, you would probably find some people recently in, say, disability studies or something like that, who have written about that, and maybe it influenced their philosophy. Nobody, as I said, comes to mind for me, but I mean, there are a lot of philosophers who have had, let's say, difficulties expressing themselves. Thomas Aquinas for a long time was called the dumb ox because he was a big old guy and didn't say much of anything. And then when he did, his classmates were very surprised by how smart he was because they thought he was a big dummy. So, there's all sorts of stuff like that. Elianic says, have there ever been any philosophers who decided to stop, or I decided to stop reading because they were taking me to a mentally unhealthy place? No, there's nobody who I decided to stop reading. I know other people in the field who have said, yeah, I'm not going to read this person because I find them depressing or aggravating. I mean, for me, it's more like, am I getting anything out of reading this person's stuff, given that I could be reading other people's stuff? So there's quite a few philosophers whose works, and they're usually not great philosophers; they're kind of second rate or third rate, who I've said, yeah, I'm not. This is not worth my time. Somebody else can read this person. Um, and I think that's perfectly legitimate to do. It's not as if you could read everybody. It's not as if you're under some sort of moral imperative to give everybody a chance or something like that. I tend to think, and this is a little bit off topic, that it's your life. You decide what you want to read. So if you don't want to read Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, you don't have to. If you read Nietzsche and you're like, I don't like this guy because he's kind of a prick, and he's unfair to other philosophers, I think that's okay. You don't have to necessarily read them. Um, but I haven't been so influenced by philosophers and what it is that they have to say. I think because I've always had kind of a strong sense of self, and I tend to be pretty critical and push back and say, "Well, what's your evidence for that, buddy?" Um, I haven't had any philosophers that did that to me. I will say, and this is something I've been meaning to write about, there are quite a few people who will be too uncritical in reading philosophers who are critical of certain things. So every once in a while, you get somebody who's like, I read this person and they said there's no such thing as free will, and now I feel really bad because of that. And you're like, well, who the hell ever told you that they were right? Why would you assume that just because some philosopher has said something that it's actually correct? Another good example of this, people are like, I don't know if I can buy into Stoicism because Nietzsche criticized it or Hegel criticized it. And you'd be like, well, how do you know that Nietzsche's right or Hegel's right about this sort of thing? So I think if if you are finding yourself saying, "Oh, I can't read this person anymore because they're depressing me," you want to think about why it is that spending your time reading somebody whose thoughts you don't have to accept is bothering you so much. I do think that there are a lot of people who waste our time a bit, expecting us to read them, but that's a different matter. So, all right. Let's see. Ellie says, or Eli says, "Are you a fan of Merciful Fate or King Diamond?" Nah, I'm not really into them. I'll tell you who really was into them though. My sister, my younger sister, got really, really into King Diamond, and I think it was in part. I mean, both of us were into metal, but I think it was in part the sort of like theatrical voice and stuff like that. I'll say this: I have a grudging respect for them, but I don't really listen to them much. So Black Prairie says, "What can be philosophically said about cybernetic augmentations on the human body? Any works that focus on this aspect of transhumanism? I've been really into cyberpunk stories, if that helps." I mean, there's an entire cyborg manifesto by Donna Haraway that was written quite a while ago. And I think, reading the sort of cyberpunkish speculative fiction is good for thinking about these things too. So sort of like the answer that I gave a bit earlier, where about the extraterrestrials, where I was saying, we got philosophy and then we've got speculative fiction. And there's a lot of great philosophy that's going on in speculative fiction. Um, the idea of augmenting ourselves with technology goes back a long, long ways. And I would say that, the way to go with this is not to look for stuff that's just specifically about implants or stuff like that, but to think about philosophy of technology more broadly. And the first, speculations about this are already there in Plato and Aristotle, thinking about writing as a technology and thinking about mechanical things with Aristotle. But we move forward into modern times and we have very interesting discussions all over the place. Like, Maurice Merleau-Ponty talking about the blind person using a cane, and that the cane is actually not just a tool, but it extends their perceptual sphere. Derrida has a lot of stuff about how does he put it, prostheses, and so there's a ton of things out there. And there's also stuff sort of warning us, like Heidegger's worries about in framing and the question concerning technology could be applied to many of these things that would be done to our bodies to augment ourselves. So there's lots and lots of interesting philosophy of technology stuff out there that I think would be very relevant to that. Um, transhumanism is an interesting topic because there's different varieties, right? There's the almost like we're going to worship the machines kind of stuff, or we're going to get, you know, past our humanity. The ancients, the medievals, the moderns are all wrong about the human essence. We need to be free of this. There's the more measured kind of, well, let's think about where this is taking us. Maybe we've always been changing ourselves in important ways, kind of stuff. So it's not as if there's just one single transhumanism out there. Um, all right. Ridicule. Have you read Henry George's Progress and Poverty? I haven't. Sounds kind of like an interesting thing, but I don't know if I've actually read any Henry George. Stanislaw, are you familiar with Władysław Tartakiewicz works? I'm not, unfortunately, so nothing I can really say about that. John, I really loved your videos on Heraclitus. Do you have any favorite scholars, interpreters, or readers of the pre-Socratics, particularly Heraclitus, Parmenides, Anaximander, and/or Empedocles? I don't. I mean, I'm not a secondary works kind of person very much. There's lots of interesting discussions, but we're always hampered by the fact that what we're doing is working off of fragments rather than entire texts, unfortunately. Even with Parmenides, we only have portions of the poem, and the fragments that we have of Heraclitus are from a much larger lost work on nature that would, maybe someday we'll find a manuscript of it. That would be awesome. So a lot of the stuff that I see talking about this tends to be kind of speculative and very much like, well, it could mean this, and sometimes they jump into therefore it does mean this. I do want to say though that there are some really interesting discussions of these ancient philosophers in people that are coming later, like Plato and Aristotle, and to a certain extent Diogenes Laertes. There's lots of references to them in other thinkers, especially those who are more eclectic in their nature, like Cicero or Plutarch. But I don't have a lot of favorites among like historians of philosophy, so to speak. Um, all right, Sayed says, "Good evening, Professor." Good evening to you. It's noon here, or a little past noon. Yorick, is it reason? Oh, this is a good question. Is it reasonable to try to get an essay or paper published as a student, or does it practically require a PhD to have a good shot at getting published? So, I would say this first, right off the bat. If the place that you want to publish in, and there are thousands of venues that you can publish in, if they demand that you have a PhD, then they're not a good place to publish, because the good philosophy journals are not going to be, they're going to be doing blind review, right? So it doesn't matter what your credentials are. You could be, as we call them, independent scholars who may or may not have a PhD, or a master's for that matter. um, it could be that you just read a lot of philosophy on your own, and if they really do have double blind review, then that's not supposed to matter. And there's many people who publish things without having advanced degrees that are quite good. There are also, I'll say, there are journals that are specifically devoted to publishing undergraduate, um, or graduate student work. So you can easily Google those and find them. There's a number of them in philosophy. Sometimes other journals too will have like a special edition, where they're publishing graduate students. Also at conferences, which is another way of getting your papers workshopped. Many conferences will have special panels or sessions just for students, undergraduate or graduate students. For example, if I remember right, the Aristotle and Aristotelian Tradition Conference that I just went to last month had one panel that was all graduate students, and it's pretty common. So I published some things as a graduate student, and we were actually encouraged to see if we could do so. So I would encourage you to look around for places that look like a good fit for the kind of stuff that you want to do. And another thing, you didn't ask about this, but I would also say this. If you want to be publishing in journals, you should be reading journals, and you get a sense after a while, if you read enough, that like, oh, this would be a good journal for me, or this probably wouldn't be a good journal for me to send stuff off to. They're probably not going to be receptive to the style or the topics, or the approach that I'm interested in taking here. And there's a lot of specialty journals. So for example, I've published stuff on St. Anselm in the St. Anselm Journal. In I'm blanking on it. It's published by the Franciscan University Steubenville. but also in Cistercian studies quarterly. And why Cistercians? Because Cistercians are an offshoot of the Benedictines. Anselm was a Benedictine, et cetera, et cetera. So that might be helpful for you. But I would, and the other thing that I'll say, because I don't want to keep saying yes, one more thing. Um, it can be discouraging sending your work out, or anxiety provoking too, and not getting the response that you would like, because the response you want is people writing back and saying, holy shit, this is awesome, we want to publish your work, right? That doesn't always happen, and you might get a revise and resubmit, in which case you'll get some feedback which could be helpful or not helpful. Sometimes you'll just get like what they call a desk rejection, where it doesn't even go to the reviewers, and the editor is like, "Ah, we don't want this stuff." Um, so be prepared for rejection, but don't allow the fact that one journal and the editor and the referees have said no to you there be taken as, well, my stuff isn't any good and nobody wants to look at it or read it. Because I can tell you that I have sometimes um, submitted something to one place and I got feedback and I was like, this is off base, and then I submit it somewhere else and they're like, holy shit, this is awesome, we want to publish this. It's a real crapshoot. You don't know, or rather a black box, right? Because it's not totally up to chance. It's more like it's human motivations that you don't fully understand, right? So worth keeping in mind. But that's a great question. All right, ADN, less philosophy stuff. Favorite metal bands? Yeah, I got a lot of, and I don't have a favorite band, right? If you'd asked me in my teen years and maybe even my 20s, probably I would have said Iron Maiden, and they're definitely up there in like the top five still. But I love Motorhead and Judas Priest, Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, Uriah Heep. I would say I like almost as much as those two, and I consider Uriah Heep some very important early metal too. Um, I like the band. There's quite a few new wave of British heavy metal bands that I really like. So, Tank, who are kind of similar to Motorhead, Raven, Girls' School, Tokyo Blade. I wish they had done better. Same with Tigers of Pantang. Um, and there's some more recent bands. I mean, I also like Rat. They're in my top group. There's some like international bands like Dio, where he drew on talent from all over the place, and of course the precursor Rainbow, where Richie Blackmore kind of apprenticed Ronnie James Dio. There's some more recent bands that I really like. Orchid, for example, I kind of wish that they stayed together and didn't stop producing albums, because they're my favorite doom metal band. So there's lots and lots of bands that I really like, and I'll mention too that I've gotten to see some pretty good bands lately, including, and I'll give a shout out here to a band that they were, sort of like girl school, an all woman band back in the 1980s, Vixen. And in the 1980s, they were okay. They weren't great, but they were good. And they were a little bit on the softer side. We saw them at Summerfest. And I say we, me and my child Kat, who's also a metalhead, and they were pretty amazing. Now, that's because they only have one original member left, the drummer. The guitarist who started with them in 2017, she also plays in a Guns N' Roses tribute band, Paradise Kitty. She's really solid. They have a new bassist who was essentially handpicked by the previous bassist to take over for her. Some Brazilian, Yulia, I forget her last name, and she is just incredible and a great singer, sort of like Juan Crocier with Rat, playing bass and also singing. And then the new singer is somebody probably a bit older than me, but she's really got the pipes and she's a great front woman. And so there's sometimes bands that started out maybe not quite so strong, but they upgraded as they went along, right? So, All right. Mark says, why is Cicero so awesome? I reread his Republic and Laws recently. Great text. How would you compare his use of the dialogue format to Plato? Any other writers you think wrote great dialogues? Okay, so a lot of things there. Um, let's start with the dialogues. I don't think that Cicero's dialogues are as dialogue as are Plato's. I think sometimes Cicero uses the dialogue format more as a rhetorical device and less as something essential to what he's doing. But his dialogues are in fact genuine dialogues, as opposed to some other writers where and Plato sometimes does this, where there's long sections where Socrates is like, and let me explain this to you. Doesn't it seem like this? And they're like, oh yes, Socrates, go on, you know. Um, why is Cicero so great? So I think it has to do with a couple factors. One is, Cicero was able to study with great representatives of all the major philosophies that were around at his time, and he could sort of assimilate them. He had time to think about them. And he's not writing most of his stuff as a young man. He's writing it much later on, when he's no longer able to be involved with politics because Caesar's faction has won. He's also writing quite a few of his works as a consolation for himself after the death of the person he was probably closest to, his daughter Julia. I may be having a senior moment here myself. And the other thing that's important to remember about Cicero, and you see this in the prefaces to a lot of his texts, is that he had a project. And his project was to take philosophy from Greek, the language, and put it into a Roman Latin format to demonstrate that philosophy could, in fact, be done in Latin. And I want to say that there's something about having like a big project that really brings out the best in certain philosophers. So, like maybe Plato's project originally was to sort of memorialize his great teacher, Socrates, and then it morphed into something more. Aristotle's project was sort of like to contribute to and understand all these different fields of phenomena and knowledge, right? So having a big project like that can often be quite helpful. Now, other writers who wrote great dialogues, well, Augustine is a prime example, right? Augustine has some pretty excellent dialogues, and so does Anselm of Canterbury. You could think of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy as a dialogue too, right? I mean, it's written in kind of a novel format, but it's a dialogue between Boethius and Lady Philosophy, who shows up and says, "Why so glum, my friend?" And we could go on further. I mean, Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion, brilliant. And he uses a sort of technique that he's getting from Cicero in Cicero's dialogue on the nature of the gods, right? Which is to have the characters kind of spar off against each other and to endorse none of their positive statements, but all the negative conclusions. And it goes on down to the present. There are still philosophers writing in dialogue format today, which I think is quite good. So, yeah, some good questions there. Let's see what else we have. Oh, Mondavarius. What's the best library you've ever visited? That is an interesting question. So, I don't usually go and like visit libraries unless I'm actually going to use them. And I will talk about a couple libraries. So, the ones that I've used the most for my own research and found the best. One of them is probably no longer as good anymore, and that was the Southern Illinois University at Carbondale Morris Library. which was at that time just excellent. And it set the standard for me because, Southern Illinois University, Carbondale is kind of a low tier. It's got a graduate school, it's got a law school, right? But it's not considered to be like a great school or anything like that. But they had just an amazing library, so much resources, really quite extensive. I understand there have been a lot of cuts to the library since then, which is unfortunate. And so I just sort of took it for granted that, well, if things are this good at Carbondale, they must be this good everywhere, which is definitely not the case. Another library where I did a lot of research is Notre Dame University's Hesburgh Library, which is this giant tower. You may have seen pictures of it. If you Google touchdown Jesus, you will get to see a picture of the Hesburgh Tower. And why is it called Touchdown Jesus? Because it's got a big mosaic of Jesus with his arms up like this, which is the signal in football for a touchdown. So and that place, holy crap, did they have amazing holdings. I did a lot of the research for my book, Reason Fulfilled by Revelation, the 1930s Christian philosophy debates in France, at that place as well. And then another smaller library, but one that I have a particular attachment to, and I found to be quite a good place, was St. Anselm College's Geisel Library, which has the St. Anselm collection. So I did 2 summer research fellowships, very fortunately funded by the Institute for St. Anselm Studies there over the years. And I used their resources, and it was really awesome. And the people there are really great too. I would like to point out too, though, that here in Milwaukee, our central library, our public library, the central one, is an amazing place. It's beautiful outside and it's beautiful inside as well. And I've spent so much time there over the years. Started going there when I was in high school, and we would have to drive in and do research there. And now it's just blocks away. I actually have some books on hold there that I have to go get on Monday because I won't be able to go today. And they have, in addition to the entire library and what they've got 4 basement levels, all of which are filled with what they call storage tiers. And a storage tier are the books that you can get. They'll bring them up for you, and you just have to request them. So 4 stories underground with the same footprint as the library, as far as I understand. They also have some really cool stuff in their special collections, including a lot of Wisconsin, Arkham House publications, those sorts of things. So those are some of my favorite libraries. I don't know what would count as the best. It's probably, we have to decide what the criteria for that are. All right. Shalu Priya says how to deal with the predicament of irreversibility in terms of harsh deeds in the past that can't be undone but feed on the conscience as we go on with time, becoming painfully self-conscious as we go on. Okay, so everything's irreversible in that sense. Good deeds, bad deeds, right? Um, Things that we do in general, because time moves in one direction, are irreversible. But if you've done wrong to somebody, you can try to make amends. You can try to also think about the person that you are and try to become a better person and improve yourself and teach other people about stuff. So I think that it's not irreversibility, it's dealing with the fact that you are now conscious of, like, you did something wrong and you're not happy with yourself over the effects of it. Sometimes you can't fix the original situation, but maybe you can, as we say, pay it forward by helping somebody else who you should have helped in the past, or contributing to, let's say you were mean to a certain kind of people, maybe you can be good to that kind of people going forward in the future. I think back to all the different ways in which I was messed up in the past. Sometimes, and I haven't totally overcome all of these either. And some of the people that I was mean to, or even animals that I was mean to or thoughtless to, could I have done better? Yes. They're gone. Can I do better in the present? Yeah, that's a possibility. So maybe that'll help. All right, Gus, maybe a basic question, but what does Nietzsche mean by will to power? Yeah, that is a basic question, but it's a really important basic question now, isn't it? Because that's central to Nietzsche's thought. So the will to power takes a lot of different forms. Nietzsche thinks that almost everything has some manifestation of this. I mean, it obviously gets much more complex as we move up into conscious beings and those that have societies and all that. And the idea is that you have a will and you know what that will is by what it does. So by virtue of having a will, being a living thing, you attempt to impose yourself on other things, and other things are doing that to you, and you can push back against it, you can incorporate them into yourself, but ultimately, you're this will to power that wants to have more life, and to have the opportunity to expend itself, to do things, to determine things, and you do so in a context of other wills to power, which you may dominate or you may exploit. And then you may be dominated or exploited in turn as well. And even your body and the things that come out of your body for Nietzsche, the notion of a soul or a spirit, those are all sort of like little wills that get unified or at least integrated by a greater will that is you. And so that's maybe a thumbnail sketch of the will to power. All right. Let's see here. Just skipped a little bit. Trying to get back to Christopher asked, do you agree with Hegel's philosophy? If not, what do you disagree with? I mean, I agree with Hegel's philosophy in some things, and I disagree with him in other things. And obviously, one of the most important areas of disagreement is thinking that history didn't end in, you know, 1807 or 1816, or pick whatever else date you want. I also think that Hegel, despite his criticisms of formalism, is often rather too formalistic himself in his arrangements of stuff, and his understandings of things. I think he's obviously wrong in saying in the history of philosophy that none of us could be Stoics or Epicureans or anything else in the present. I think that there's a lot of things where he says things and you're like, yeah, that's not right. I get what he's saying. I get why he's saying it, but here's where I think he's actually got things wrong. I think he can often be a little bit too rigid and one-sided, which is interesting because these are things that he accuses others of in his takes on how consciousness has developed. But I think that there's a lot of really good stuff to pull out of Hegel. One of the parts of the phenomenology that I probably like the best is buried deep in the spirit section, and it's his analysis of moral action and how complicated and many factored it is, and that it's so difficult to do a purely good thing. And he explains why, right? It leads you through it. So those are some cool things. um, so this is cool. Black Prairie has something responding to Yorick and says that they're an undergrad. They've gotten two of their essays published in two different journals from their university. That's really awesome to read. Um, you know, as I mentioned, there are undergraduate journals, but there's nothing that keeps like an undergrad or a graduate student from sending out their work to just a regular journal and seeing if somebody will go for it, right? E. Demont, I'm just starting Plato. In your recent video on depression, you talk about how Plato helped you out. Can you tell me which part? Yeah, I would say that, thinking about the arrangement of the soul was useful. Interestingly, Plato himself doesn't talk about sadness or depression very much, but a lot of later thinkers used Plato's tripartite conception of the soul, including a lot of Christian thinkers. And sadness, or tristitia, is lupe, actually, in Greek. Pain, more broadly, is one of the eight capital vices, for example, in John Cassian. And where does that occur? It occurs in the same part of the soul that we get angry with, the thumos. And so, thinking about what later Platonists did with that is quite helpful. I would also say too, that, and this is not something unique to Plato. This is kind of a virtue ethics thing in general. If you want to be able to regulate your life well and not give in to, sadness, sorrow, depression, or the other things that often accompany it, irritability, anger, anxiety, then figuring out how to unscrew yourself up, because you start out screwed up, can be extraordinarily helpful. And the other thing that's important too is, Plato, and again, this is something that you see in all the virtue ethics traditions. A lot of the troubles that we have are caused by mistakes on a cognitive level. And this is something that you see worked out in Plato's dialogues over and over again. You think that death is a bad thing. Why do you think it's a bad thing? Let's evaluate. Let's think this through. Do we really know enough about death to say that it is the catastrophe that we believe it to be? I mean, Plato's got Socrates talking about these sorts of things. So I think that might be helpful. August says, I felt with my lack of formal philosophy training that whenever I would go write something or read something, I always confront the questions. Have I read this correctly? Are there tools for this? Um, I mean, it should get better over time, right? And with multiple reads, you do have to ask yourself, what are the standards that you're trying to impose upon yourself or question yourself about? What constitutes a correct reading? And there's probably multiple levels to this. Like if you read Plato's Apology and somebody asks you, what's that book about? And you're like, well, Socrates is thinking about hot dogs and how much he really loves hot dogs and that he should go get a hot dog from the vendor in the park. Obviously, that's a wrong reading, right? And that's like a totally wrong reading, other than the fact that it's got a guy named Socrates in it. But then, getting to, well, I read it this time, and the time before, I didn't quite realize what Socrates was talking about with the underworld and being able to question Achilles and, all these other people and them not being able to kill him for that. And then thinking about the fact that one of the implications of this is that Socrates is going to be doing his constant questioning of people down in Hades, and he's probably going to be pissing off the dead who then can't kill him. Okay, that might not be something that you get the first time you read it, or the second time, or the third time. And are you wrong in this? Are you incorrect in not noting that? Maybe not, because that's kind of a sideline. I mean, figuring out who. So here's a good example. Um, when I teach the apology to my undergrad students, I always give them an assignment: explain who the old accusers are and why they're upset with Socrates and why Socrates is more afraid of them than the new accusers. And a lot of the students get it right, and then some students will be like, Miletus and Anytus are the old accusers. And you're like, well, that's wrong. Okay. So, those are those sort of lower level incorrect things, right? But, if you read through the old accusers and the first couple times you don't notice that Socrates doesn't say that they don't know anything, The poets don't know what they're doing. The politicians don't know what they're doing. He doesn't explain about the redders, although he says that they're being represented. But the craftspeople do know something, right? The problem is that they think that because they know something in their craft, they know other things. So, being able to tell, at these different levels what you're getting right and what you're maybe missing or getting wrong about it, that's important. And how do you check this? Well, there isn't any recipe for that. But you can compare your reading with other people's readings, right? This is where having classes and resources and stuff like that can be very helpful, I'd say. All right. Let's see here. Sayed says, can you talk a bit about the best way to get the general public interested in theory and philosophy, especially now when the student culture is so apathetically ironic? A concerned president of my uni's philosophy club. So, um, there isn't any like automatic way to get the general public interested in stuff. And oftentimes, when you do get the general public interested in philosophy stuff, they manage to like do it in a wrong-headed and superficial way. So, for example, if Macron, president of France, quotes Hegel, suddenly Hegel gets mentioned in the French national newspapers. Then it goes worldwide, and people are like, "See, there's a politician who cares about Hegel." But does Macron actually understand Hegel? Probably not. I mean, I don't know the guy, but it's probably debatable. And then all the people will weigh in with crap about, oh, Hegel this, Hegel that, and reporters will get on it and screw it up typically, right? I mean, we see this every year when we try to get reporters interested in Stoicon and the Stoicon X's and Stoic Week, and many of them really muff it up and misquote us and stuff like that. So. Uh, I guess what I'm saying is if you do want to try to get the public interested in philosophy, put your bar really, really low, right? And have low expectations. Be ready to like try to address them. And instead of like getting ticked off at them, you stupid idiots, you got Plato wrong or you got Descartes wrong, be there as a resource to explain to them. I think that there's a lot of things that we can call like doorways or gateway drugs or whatever to get people interested in philosophy. So let's take Descartes, for example. Um, Everybody knows I think, therefore I am. And there's all sorts of memes out there about it. And then you could say, well, what is thinking? What counts as thinking? And as it turns out, Descartes gives you a list of that in Meditations 2, where he says, "What is it to be a thinking thing? A thing that affirms, denies, wills against, doubts, senses, feels, all these sorts of things." Now you've opened up the possibility for conversations to happen. So this is exactly the sort of thing you could do, with your philosophy club. I think that would be great. And there's like you open the doors, you get discussions going, and you keep coming back to the text, not in sort of a, well, you must have read the text kind of way, but sort of like, hey, so and so has already talked about this. Wouldn't it be cool if we read this short passage and then we thought about this? And by the way, if you want to know more about Descartes, here's the books that he wrote, and you can check these out. They're available at the university library or at the bookstore. So I guess in part what I'm saying is, give them kind of bite-sized chunks and try to make it stuff that people would be curious about or are worried by. So, Descartes is a good person to start with. I mean, another interesting thing you could do with Descartes, um, people are really interested in artificial intelligence right now, and the capacity for machines to mimic us human beings. So he talks about that in Discourse Section 5. And he lays out some criteria for how we can tell the difference between a human being that has a mind and a machine that doesn't have a mind but tries to imitate a human being. That could be, I mean, that would be a big draw, right? So, and Said, I'd say too, you can find my email on the uh, about page for my channel. It says like for business inquiries. If you've got a philosophy club, and this goes for anybody else who's out there like doing public philosophy, and that's what Said is talking about, doing public philosophy, philosophy for the public. And you got a club and you want to kick around an idea or two, go ahead and email me about it. I'm happy to see people doing that. All right, Eli A. What ideas, concepts of Jacques Lacan are you critical of, if any? I mean, less an idea and more like his overall style. Lacan is deliberately an obscure writer, and I think he didn't do himself any favors by doing that. One thing I do like about Lacan, Freud gets a lot of flack for the Oedipus complex, and I think the Oedipus complex is probably, I mean, maybe there are some people out there who it does fit, but it's definitely not the blueprint for humanity. Lacan recognizes that, and he tells you that at different points in his seminars, right? Um, that it's just one of many different configurations of the symbolic that's possible. And I'll mention another thing too. I think there's things that like Lacan put out there and then people they reified into ideas like the mirror stage, right? The mirror stage is not an explanation of people in general. It's something that you progress through and you leave behind. Oedipus complex too, by the way, if you have it, is something that you're supposed to actually like work through and leave behind, not the general blueprint for human nature or something like that. I think there's a lot of cases where Lacan is drawing on stuff that he's read and he's being a little bit too precious with it and trying to get so much mileage out of it. He's also very defensive when it comes to other psychoanalysts, psychotherapists, psychologists, and perhaps a little bit too dismissive of other people's work at points. So that's probably enough there. Uh, E. Dermot says you said you're not a stoic and you're more of an eclectic. Can you tell me what your influences are when it comes to how you handle life? I mean, I draw heavily on the Stoics, just like Cicero did. The Aristotelian tradition, the Platonist tradition, even the Epicureans, a lot of Christian thinkers, particularly early Christian thinkers who were engaged with all of those schools, the existentialists, dialectical philosophers like Hegel, all of these sorts of things play a role for me. Um, Important critical thinkers like Mary Wollstonecraft, more recent feminist thinkers, other anti-racist thinkers play a role in my approach to things. But the Stoics are important, and I will say this: I probably know more and use more of Stoicism than many of the people out there who call themselves Stoics, not the high level ones, but all the beginners, because there's too many people that are like, I want to be on team X. And we don't really need to be on teams. As a matter of fact, Matthew Sharp recently published a great piece about why this is such a problem in his Medium publication. So worth checking out. All right, Galen says, have you got any individuals from the Desert Fathers or maybe the Philokalia you found helpful in the areas of philosophy that you work in dealing with anger? Yeah, and I don't worry about the Desert Fathers as such. That was just like a nice designation that people lump together for putting things into a book. I mean, what is John Cassian? Who are his conferences with? Those guys out in the desert in Egypt, right? So John Cassian is like one major resource, and so is Evagrius Ponticus, right? So those are quite important. Maximus the Confessor is somebody pretty interesting, well worth checking out from the Philokalia. There's all sorts of people, but I mean, Cassian and Ponticus are probably the ones I'm drawing on the most. Theoros, could you recommend philosophers who discuss that there are intrinsic schemas, structures in our minds that determine the way we can think about or comprehend reality? Yeah, Immanuel Kant, right? I mean, what do you think the first critique and the prolegomena are touching on when they talk about categories of the understanding or concepts of the pure understanding? That's that, right? Rene Descartes thinks that the concept of truth is in our mind and that we have all sorts of other innate ideas in the great treasure house or thesaurus of our mind. This is a pretty commonplace sort of thing, all the way down to those who want to say linguistic structures are, fundamental and basic to us in the 20th century. So, but a lot of these things turn out to be not so cut and dried as the theorists make them out to be. Oh, here's a good question from Wes Wood. What did you like and what did you dislike about your philosophy classes when you were in college? So, when I was in college, as opposed to graduate school, I only had two philosophy professors, but I got to read some philosophy in other classes. And both of my professors were really near retirement age and probably should have retired. They weren't good teachers at all. The one was constantly scheduling his classes at 8 and 9 in the morning, and he was not a morning person. And I even asked him about why he did that. And he said, so I can get my important work done later in the day when I'm actually awake. And I had like ethics with him and intro and um, logic, and I know I had a couple other classes with the guy. And then he ended up like becoming the dean after a while, and kind of, he was also busy with this history project that he had going on. So he didn't really care much about philosophy. He let me do what I wanted to do, you know. And then we had the other guy who did the history of philosophy stuff, took ancient and medieval with him, modern, contemporary. And here's this will give you an idea of what contemporary philosophy was, right? They didn't know anything about contemporary analytic philosophy. I think the latest thinker that we read was Ryle. And this is in the 1990s, So they just hadn't kept up on the literature. And they thought that process philosophy was still an important area of philosophy. Existentialism was really big. They didn't know much about like critical philosophy or, let alone like, contemporary philosophy of language. And so their classes were, very old school and in some respects not very challenging or interesting. I did a lot on my own as an undergraduate. No, I was also partying a lot and getting, being in relationships and playing in bands. So I had plenty of stuff to keep me busy. Right? But I didn't get any real like formation or structure to my education. Now, that said, that probably benefited me. I've seen a lot of people who went to schools where they had a lot of structure and they come out of it with this idea that they now know where everything fits in the history of philosophy, and they usually have it wrong, right? So, there is no like ideal teaching and learning situation. Guy, can't find a good answer online. What does Hegel really mean by spirit? How can vague concepts like the age or the world have spirits? Well, the age or the world aren't concepts, they're realities, right? And spirit is, if you want to translate it as the interplay between consciousness, self consciousness, and history and culture, that might work as well, right? There's all sorts of spirits that are all part of world spirit, and world spirit unfolds itself and develops itself, and it does so differently in different ages. I mean, this is all easy to find stuff. I mean, I don't think that you can't find a good answer online. I think you probably haven't dug very much, um, because there's lots and lots of discussions of what spirit means. Massacre, as a Catholic, what is your view on the historicity or historical accuracy of the Bible, including the New Testament? Do you care about historical variation, potential inaccuracies? Why or why not? I don't care an awful lot about them. Like I'm not worried about whether Jonah was swallowed by a whale or something like that. And I don't know why you bring up being Catholic, because the Catholic Church has been pretty clear about this for at least a century, that a lot of these stories are stories. They're not meant to be taken completely literally. Um, I mean, I remember I'm forgetting which encyclical it's in, but John Paul had an interesting remark about the Cain and Abel story, where he's like, "What matters in this story is not whether there was a Cain or Abel, or whether these were the only two other humans besides Adam and Eve at the time. What matters is that the first death is a murder, and we need to think about that, right?" When it comes to the Gospels, I have no reason to think that it's all mythology or some crazy bullshit like that. That you always got to ask with people who are like, "I'm going to debunk." What's their motive? What are they getting out of that? And there's some things that are more important than others. I mean, the teaching. I come back to this every time that people ask me about Christianity. If you claim to care about this Jesus guy and want to follow him, then you got to read or reread the Sermon on the Mount and the other places where he's teaching, and you follow that stuff, right? Does it matter like how many loaves and fishes there were? That's not what the point of the story is, right? The point is to make us think about the nature of abundance, right? Or why it's important to feed a crowd, or why Jesus takes pity on them, and coming back to the Sermon on the Mount, if you can't implement those teachings, then all the other stuff is kind of besides the point. So that's my view on it. Salman Salvador, thoughts on Michael de Biran. So I don't know a Michael de Biran. I know a Maine de Biran. And I've read a little bit of his stuff, but it's been a long time. He's an interesting philosopher who French people often tend to read and reference, but nobody else really does. As a matter of fact, Merleau-Ponty has a great set of lectures that he gave on the unity of the soul and the body in Descartes, Man de Biran, and Bergson, which kind of shows you where he fits in. But, you know, Abi Pratap, how to overcome stuttering or stammering. I don't know. I mean, it's not an area of my work. There's plenty of people out there I think that you could consult, that might help you out with that. Um, Michael says, "My past is like a book of unwritten chapters with no text or story. Absolute social isolation all of high school, college, mid 20s. How can I know how I want to contribute value to life with no history?" Well, you don't have no history. You're being hyperbolic there. You have a history. The history is of disengagement and isolation, right? And I would say, look at other people who've been similarly isolated and see if they provide you with any models. But maybe you don't want to contribute value. You need to think that out too. Um, Emil Durkheim would love to hear more about you. Would love to hear you expand on your idea of divine providence of the world. How does science generally tend to operate within it? I mean, wouldn't if you believe in divine providence, wouldn't the development of the sciences also be part of that divine providence? Think about Antonin Sertillange, the great 20th century Thomist French writer, who had no problem in some of his books. I'm not sure if they've been translated into English, talking about how the theory of evolution isn't really a major concern, because if you believe in a providential ordering of the universe, why the hell wouldn't God use evolution as a tool? Um, William, any thoughts on how to read some philosophy of history? Find a philosophy of history book and read it. you know, there's plenty of authors out there. I think one of the ones that's kind of pedestrian but isn't going to steer you wrong. Friedrich Cobblestone. There's plenty of history of philosophy stuff you can read. Um, let's see here. Malvika says, "Since getting into philosophy, I find myself doubting all that I have read. Spent a month reading up on the best way to read. Dad thinks I'm going crazy. Did this ever happen to you?" Okay, so that's actually a good concern. This is something that does happen to people when they start studying philosophy. Sometimes it just happens by reading Descartes and going through meditations one and two and being like, holy crap, I don't actually know anything for sure. This is terrible, right? And I've known people who had that sort of existential crisis. And there's the like reading a bunch of different people and being like, I don't know which of these are correct anymore. I mean, there's a remedy for that though, which is continuing on and studying more philosophy and lowering the bar for what you need in order to believe that somebody might have things at least halfway right. Epictetus, talking about the beginning of philosophy, disagrees with Plato and Aristotle, who want to say it's in something like wonder or awe. And Epictetus says, no, it's in seeing the differences of viewpoint between human beings about important stuff and then wondering, are any of these actually correct? And then trying to figure it out. So there's philosophers who themselves have expressed these sorts of problems. Rene Descartes, this is if you read his discourse on method, he says that it's because there were so many things that I thought were right that it turned out not to be so, and then there's like a diversity of opinion that made me worry about whether I could actually arrive at truth or not. You're not alone in that, right? So I guess to your dad, you could say, hey, there's other big name philosophers who've run into this problem before in the past too, right? Okay, Justin says being so well read with so many philosophers in their works, what are some major takeaways that we can apply to our lives? Not in a day to day way, but more so what we ought to be doing or working toward. So I'll say I'm not that well read. I don't think anybody's that well read. I did a quick takes about this a while back about the concern about being well read. It's impossible to be truly well read in this time, but okay, so major takeaways, not in a day to day way, but more what we ought to be doing or working toward. So this is a preoccupation in ancient philosophy and also in a lot of medieval and modern philosophy. How should I be orienting my life? There's lots of potential paths to take, and many of them seem quite attractive. How should I how should I decide? Are there any criteria, or is it just like a crapshoot, or should I just try a bunch of different things out? Right? That's a really important topic, isn't it? And we see this discussed by Plato, by Aristotle, by the Stoics, by Cicero, by Boethius, by Augustine, and we could keep going forward, right? Um, and I think another big question. I actually like this quite a bit. What are the big questions that I should be concerned with that kind of put other questions into place? What kind of person do I want to be? And what do I have to do to move from the person who I discover myself to be now to being that kind of person? And why do I want to become that kind of person? It's for example, somebody could have an awakening and they're like, I thought I just wanted to make a ton of money. And why did I want to do that? So I could have a nice, secure lifestyle for my family that I want to have and enjoy myself. I don't want to hurt anybody in the process. I don't want to cheat, lie, steal, but I want to work hard and maybe build a business or a career and have this fulfilling life. And then at a certain point, they're like, well, that might not make me happy. I see other people doing this and then they have midlife crises. What is life really about? That's a really great question to ask yourself. So I think that is a good question to ask. Leslie says, Christ says, judge no one in the first half of John. He discusses not judging others in depth. Blondel refers to this duty, seeming to incur. We offer mercy and patience and beatitude thoughts. Yeah, he's not saying don't make any judgments. He's saying don't judge other people, unless you want to be judged. If you're content being judged, go ahead and be judged, right? And you do have to make judgments. Everybody in moral philosophy, including Blondell, knows that the question is whether you're going to make them in a good way. It's not as if judgment and charity are incompatible with each other. This is a classic problem. I've written quite a few things on Anselm and how Anselm reconciles divine justice, which involves judging, with divine mercy. So you don't want to go too far in the let's not judge at all direction, because that's a mistake too. All right, Min, a wild Dr. Sadler live stream has appeared. Would you be willing to make or film a course on logic? Would love to see it. I mean, I did those things on critical thinking years and years ago with Fayetteville State that are out there. There's also somebody out there who's done a ton of great stuff. Her name is Dr. Logic. So I'm not sure why I would need to replicate what other people are already doing well when there's so much other work for me to be doing. All right. Galen Bornster says, I think I remember that St. Anselm Fellowship. Did you video document your week there? I did with the second one, not with the first one. And yeah, you can find them in my Sadler's Stories playlist. Thomas Gerard says, have you said any work in hermeneutics, Gadamer, et alia? Do you find it interesting? What value do you find in studying it? Yeah, I've studied quite a few people that are considered to be part of the hermeneutics thing. I mean, Heidegger is one of the key people. I've read Gadamer's Truth and Method and some of his other works, like his stuff on Plato's Dialogues. And Gadamer's okay. He's kind of long-winded, I would say. Somebody else in the hermeneutics broad movement that I like quite a bit is Paul Ricoeur. So, and I like hermeneutics stress on making sense out of text and that we never get away from interpretation. We always have to take account of ourselves as doing that. Ridicule, do you remember how old you were when you read your first Platonic dialogue and which one it was? So I don't know which one it was. We didn't read Plato in Intro to Philosophy because we had an Intro to Philosophy textbook. And I think the first Platonic dialogue I probably read would have been in my ancient philosophy class when I was a sophomore in college. So I probably would have been 21 at that time. And I'm guessing it probably was the Apology, you know? But or maybe the Euthyphro. I don't know. I mean, it's been such a long time. That would have been 1991, right? So more than 30 years ago. Senior, do you recommend to go and get a philosophy degree up to a PhD? I mean, if you want to, sure. I mean, recommend for what? Uh, there isn't any blanket recommendation for that. Elijah, how can Blondell's writing on sacraments and beatitude make beatitude out of a deprived past? They require virtue. What if personality disordered and brain damaged who aren't vicious but animalistic? You're blurring together a lot of stuff there. There isn't an easy answer for that. And I wouldn't focus on Blondell's writings on sacraments. I would focus on Blondell's, philosophical works, rather than stuff that's like offshoots or his recently translated, what is that? The Exigencies of Christianity or something like that. Mr. McGee, do you believe we went to the moon? Yep. The year before I was born. Patrick, what general advice and insights can you give somebody who's about to start a math philosophy double major, especially with regards to having grad school as a future goal? Just here's the advice I'd give you. Just like, take whatever you can get. Don't worry about like having to like have a big, philosophy of life or system or anything like that at this time. When you're an undergrad, your job is to learn. and to assimilate. And you don't have to worry about like getting everything into its proper place at this time. Oh, here's a great question from Colamus. Have you ever lost interest in philosophy or felt worried that you had? Do you have any suggestions for returning to that? Yeah, I have. Um, I went through a kind of malaise like that in graduate school at a certain point. And I even went to Rick Williams, my classics professor, about that. And you may have heard me tell this story before, but it could be useful for others. So I got myself stuck into this line of thinking, well, what's the point to all of this? It's like I'm learning this stuff so that I can comment on it and teach about it to other people. And I'm not going to come up with anything, really original of my own. Maybe I'll put together some interesting stuff from other people. But what's ultimately the point? And it's this feeling of sort of existential, as Sartre called it, nausea, right? Nietzsche actually uses that word too when we're being aware of the nature of life, a kind of nihilism, right? And Rick Williams said, here's the best I can give you. Um, my studies, and he's the guy who I studied Plato with. We read the Symposium together over an entire semester in Greek. He said, I'm a guy who's sitting at a fire. I didn't start the fire, and I don't have to go and start a new fire of my own. We've got a fire right here. And I do have a job. My job is to keep tending to this fire and putting logs into it and not letting the fire go out. That's my like studying, my discipline and all that. And if somebody wants to come sit by the fire with me, that's cool. If not, that's cool too, because it's a worthwhile fire. And if somebody else wants to come after me and take over my job of tending to the fire, that's great. If not, I'll just keep tending the fire. And that helped me somehow. And you can say, well, that doesn't apply exactly. Well, it doesn't have to. It's a story, right? And at a certain point, you'll either come back to it or you won't. And you can't really force it, and you shouldn't force it. I think if you've been studying philosophy, and with Colomus, I know that he has. Um, it's got its hooks in you, and sooner or later, it'll play out some line, and it'll pull you back, and you'll feel happy when that happens, or maybe vexed, right? But it'll happen, and then you start up again. And it's sort of like, getting tired of hanging out with some of your friends and you go and do your own thing for a while. And then later on, you realize, I want to hang out with them. And you go and catch up with them. That's what it's going to be like. So it happens to a lot of us, I think. And it happens not just with philosophy, but musicians with playing music. It happens to athletes who become tired of their workouts. People get tired of each other. This is a common thing because, human beings are creatures that are not like robots where they're just doing their one thing. So, all right, vegan sports bar. A friend of mine thinks we'll eventually develop an AI that can handle all human affairs and ensure world peace. This seems to me a dehumanizing and extremely dangerous idea. Thoughts? Well, I mean, I doubt that'll happen. If it does happen, handle all human affairs. I mean, I doubt that would ever be the case. Humans will always be monkeying around with things. So I'm not so worried about the dehumanizing thing. I'm more worried about crazy humans who think that AI is doing more than it's actually doing and therefore like put their stamp on other people and control other people. I mean, if there was an AI that could take over a lot of the mundane tasks that we do, and help out with things and actually engage us as human beings, that would be pretty cool, wouldn't it? I mean, that would be sort of like Ian Banks' culture series, where they live this post-scarcity future with trillions and trillions of human beings and very intelligent AIs, and everybody's got a pretty good existence. And then if you want a little excitement, well, you go out to the I forget exactly what he called the people, like special services or the frontier or something like that. The odds of that happening are pretty low. I mean, we human beings don't even really understand our own societies adequately. How the hell's an AI? Which, I mean, frankly, the AIs that are out there, they're not actually, the I is a big metaphor. They're not intelligent. They're not even remotely close to it, you know? So I'm not really concerned about that. Alionic, I think I remember you saying you wanted to be a creative writer. Do you still write poetry and or fiction? Haven't written any fiction for a long time. I wrote my wife a sonnet a while back, but I don't write a lot of poetry. But I should start again. I mean, I do write creative nonfiction from time to time. Um, so it's something I haven't given much thought or time to. An ordered whole. Do you have a structured routine to reread important works? How do you approach rereading works? I don't have anything. I just reread them. You know, a lot of times I'm rereading them. It's because I want to do a video series or a client wants me to help them with tutorials or something like that. There's no routine that I've got, and even if I did have a routine, it might not be useful for you. Oh, this is a good one from Jeff Sullivan. Platonic dialogue you've changed your mind on the most since beginning to study philosophy. So, yeah, that's a tough one. I would say um, The Republic, because, when I first read it, I think I did like buy into this is a blueprint for the perfect society, um, laid out by Plato. And the Thrasymachus thing is just sort of stage setting, and the really important thing is the ideal city that's being laid out. And my mind has changed because, first of all, it's not the ideal city, it's the second best city. They never actually lay out the ideal city in any detail because Socrates sets out a very rudimentary ideal city. And then Glaucon and Adamantus are like, these people don't have pickles. They don't have sauces for their meat and stuff like that. They're laying on beds of straw, And then Socrates is like, oh, I get it. You don't want the best city. You want a luxurious city. Let's see if we can make that work. But I don't really think, I think that's only one part of what's going on with the Republic. I think all the other parts matter. I think there is a psychology there that's really important. I think there's discussions about culture. I think there's, all this great metaphysical stuff in book 6 and 7. I think that the dialogue with Thrasymachus and the fact that Thrasymachus stays around to hear the rest of what Socrates has to say is important. All of those things are worth reading and discussing. And I think I saw them as kind of sidelines in the past. Let's see. We're getting a little bit low on time, so I don't know if I'll get to everybody's questions, but we're getting kind of close to the end. Honora, what's the book you just couldn't get through for whatever reason? That's a good question. I mean, I never read all of James Joyce's Ulysses, in part because I found it so pretentious playing around with language. And I just, after a certain point, I was like, I don't want to read this shit. People talk about how great this is, but God, there's so many other things I could be doing with my time. So that's one example right there. I'm sort of confused. Do you have any tips for trying to understand concepts, experiential concepts, which evade a sort of exact representation? No, because I don't know what that, I don't really know what those words mean. EUTS, are there other thinkers that contributed to virtue ethics? I know Aristotle was the main person for it, but are there other people who developed it? Yeah, Aristotle wasn't the main person for it. Aristotle's one of many. I think what you've gotten misled by are the people in 20th century analytic philosophy, and then their followers in the 21st century who are like, Aristotle's, we have the Renaissance of Aristotelian ethics. No, I mean, if in the ancient period, the Aristotelians were just one of many schools of virtue ethics. Virtue is important for Plato. Again, discussed in the Meno, the Republic. There's dialogue specifically on particular virtues, right? So massively important. And then there's the entire Platonic tradition carrying on through Middle Platonism with the Handbook of Platonism by Alcinous, Plutarch's many works discussing virtue, all the way into Neoplatonism. So that's another massive tradition, just as important as the Aristotelian. The Stoics, just as important. Epicureans even are focused on virtue. The Cynics were into virtue. Um, you know, all these important early Christian writers taking up the concepts, Augustine, Boethius, all the way into people like Thomas Aquinas. Virtue remains an important topic for so many other thinkers in the modern era. For example, Mary Wollstonecraft is a virtue ethicist. Virtue ethics never goes away, except in this little parochial area that we call analytic philosophy. There's still people in the 20th century, like in the Thomist tradition, like, Yves Simon writing, about moral virtue. So there's like tons and tons and tons of people. Aristotle's just one of them. Let's see, just skipped a little bit. Casper says, have you listened to the Nietzsche podcast? I haven't, unfortunately. I mean, I don't listen to a lot of people's podcasts. Who's got the time, right? If I'm generating stuff. All right, so we got about 4 minutes or so because I've got to do some other stuff today. Let's see what I can take and get into here. So here's an interesting thing by Tobias. Does philosophy contradict the concept of God's plan? No. If God has a plan and we can never fully understand it, what's the purpose of philosophy? Part of the plan, right? I mean, why would this be a contradiction there? I think what you're setting up two things. It's sort of like saying, we got the world and we got apples, and they're not exactly the same thing, and we can't know the whole world, so therefore no apples. So I would rethink that. Um, oh, Marco, I'm interested in Middle Platonism, so I'd like to ask you how you would suggest starting with Plutarch's philosophical works, getting your hands on them. They're mostly available online. There is no starting point. There is no like, here's the book to read first. Just start reading around in them. I mean, you'll see the titles. And so, like, if you're interested in virtue ethics, there's like on virtues and vices. If you're interested in friendship, how to tell a flatterer from a friend, if you're interested in the question of anger, on controlling anger, there's all sorts of people. But I will say this: there's a lot that Plutarch wrote, so there's a lot that you can dig into. Oh, Zach, here's a good one. I'm officially a philosophy professor now, so congratulations on that. Teaching next semester, very excited. Any advice on getting students to be interested in the profession? Um, be interested in the profession of being philosophy professors, that's a hard sell. I would say the first thing you got to do is get them interested in philosophy, and the way that you do that, at least, I mean, there's lots of ways to do that, but the way that's worked best for me is be relatable. You know, realize first off that you're not there to like sell them on becoming philosophy majors or anything like that. Show them that the stuff that you're studying actually has some useful application to the problems that they face as college students in their life. Be willing to talk about the student debt that they're taking on, or the fact that, you think about teleology. Whenever we talk about Aristotle and Nicomachean Ethics Book 1, I bring up, why are you here at college in the first place? You could be out there earning money doing a job. You think that this degree is going to lead to a happy life. How do you know that, right? What does a happy life look like for you? That sort of stuff, I think, really helps to sell philosophy as something that they can find valuable, and it really is about them finding it valuable, because you can tell them all you want. Oh man, this has changed my life. You're just some guy walking in there, telling them stuff. There's no reason why they have to believe you. Show them that it is, right? Let's see if I can take one other good one. Um, there was one I saw a little bit earlier. Um, okay, let's take this one. Max says, I'm in a limbo and procrastinating since I'm figuring out how and where to go after graduating from college concerning jobs. How should I slowly approach this issue? Have you been through this also? I suffered from what was called senioritis, which is a sort of burnout that happens for college students your senior year. And I just worked some what we would call dead end jobs. I worked in a gas station, in part because it gave me time to read and listen to music, and I didn't have to take my work home with me. And then I came down here to Milwaukee and worked as a temp for a mortgage company for a while, and that was pretty miserable. And then I worked as a security guard and a barista, and again, gave me plenty of exercise and time to do things. It's okay to take on, like, temporary work just to like keep a roof over your head and stuff like that, while you think about what you want to do. And this is, again, I brought up the word teleological just in a previous answer. This is you figuring out ends and means. What kind of job would you like to have? And then you think about, well, what do I have to do to move towards that job, right? So, the other thing to keep in mind is that you're dealing with an environment where jobs, often take a lot of work to get, ironically, right? Because the job is about work you're going to do. It's not so easy as just like looking in the paper and seeing a want ad and then, calling them up and coming in with a resume and filling out an application. There's a lot of hoops to jump through, especially the higher up the job gets. Um, but here's something you can keep in mind: you are not your job. If you're an American, but this is also in other places, there is a huge tendency to identify yourself with the job that you have, right? And you're not your job any more than you are your bank account or your car or anything like that. You're somebody who can get a job and do a job, and it may not be ideal, but if it provides you with an income, if you have other people depending on you for that income, then that's a good thing, right? And so I would say, try to be very realistic about these things and forgiving towards yourself. Um, it's natural to procrastinate. Nobody procrastinates because they want to procrastinate, right? It's always a sign of other stuff going on. So think to yourself, why am I procrastinating? you know is it because I'm worried about rejection? Is it because I'm disappointed with getting out of college and things not falling into place? Is it that there's two P's that often go together: procrastination and perfectionism. I'm like trying to, if I can't find the ideal job, I don't want a crappy job or something like that. Thomas points out fear of responsibility. That might be something in the background. Who knows? But exploring those things for yourself could be quite helpful. And talk with other people. I mean, this takes some vulnerability and it's a risk, but I mean, if your parents are around and they're receptive, or aunts and uncles, older people who've gone through similar things, bring it up with them and be like, "Hey, do you ever run into this? You got any advice for me?" Sometimes they can surprise you, and I will say too that um, reaching out to other people is an important part of adult life, and the advice that you get from these people after you've moved through different life transitions, different milestones can be quite different and reveal a different relationship that you have with them down the line. But there's probably other, recently graduated college students that you might chat with as well that you could maybe get some, if not helpful advice, at least some like solidarity, like, oh man, I know what that's like. Um, so that's where we'll close. I didn't get to everybody's stuff, but as I mentioned, I got another event coming up, and then I've got to go drive a while to go for a hike. But thanks for all the questions and comments. It's been another enjoyable AMA, and hopefully this helps some of you out. I see some hearts coming up. I'm not sure how that works on YouTube, but I guess good to see. So I will see you next time. We got some other cool stuff tomorrow, doing a reading of one of my favorite short stories. And then we got lots of other online events coming up this month. And we'll do another AMA next month, usually first Saturdays of the month. So I will see you there.